Okay, I'm going to kick us off. Good morning. Happy Monday. Thanks for joining us today. I am Jess Delfiaco. I'm the communications manager for the Midwest CASC. Thanks for joining us for our June science seminar, which is going to feature some team members from a round of newly funded climate adaptation research projects. Before we dive into things, as usual, we are recording this. It'll be shared on our YouTube channel and via email with all registrants. So please keep yourself muted until we get to the Q&A portion at the end of today's presentations. And feel free to put questions in the chat throughout. We'll mention this again later, but we're going to hold questions for our presenters until everyone's had a chance to give their presentations, and then we'll have plenty of time to ask questions at the end. But as things come up, feel free to pop them in the chat. For those of you who this might be your first time joining us, I'm going to say a few words about what the Midwest CASC is. So the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or CASC, is a partnership between the US Geological Survey and a consortium of institutions throughout the region, which you can see on the slide here. And we're part of a national network of these CASCs, all of which work to produce science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. We accomplish this mission in several ways, including conducting synthesis research on topics that are of importance to our region, supporting a network of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. We host workshops, events, seminars like this, as well as our annual gathering of the Midwest CASC community in the summertime, which I'll mention on our next slide. And of course, the USGS through the CASC funds climate adaptation research projects, some of which you're going to hear about today. One quick announcement is about the Summer Symposium, which is happening August 5th through 7th. We are putting the final touches on our program for this year's symposium. We would love for you all to join us there. Registration and more details is available at that link, which I'll also drop in the chat. If you haven't taken a look at that landing page in a while, we are updating it as we kind of build things out about some of the sessions and activities we're going to have there. So again, you're all invited. We hope to see you there. And you can learn more at that link. With that, I am going to hand things over to Kevin O'Donnell.
All right, thank you, Jess, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Kevin O'Donnell, and I am the Assistant Regional Administrator for the US Geological Survey Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or CASC, and I'm excited to introduce our slate of speakers today that will provide us a great overview of newly started research supported by the US Geological Survey, and that really puts new information and tools in the hands of decision makers, tribal nations, natural resource managers, and those managing our public lands here in the Midwest. The format for today's webinar follows a meet and greet strategy that will very quickly introduce you to the lead for each project and the impactful research that they will be conducting over the next couple of years. Now, these research projects have been identified through a combination of our fiscal year 2025 Midwest CASC open project solicitation. Also, we have a new exciting collaboration between the USGS and National Park Service. And then finally, the work we'll talk about today was identified through a program priority to advance the knowledge and evidence base for climate adaptation here in the Midwest. And just to quickly report out on our fiscal year 2025 open project solicitation from our institutions captured by the Midwest CASC. Last summer, we received 41 statements of interest for a total of approximately $17 million in potential research project funding. The Midwest CASC invited 13 full proposals requesting up to $4.6 million in project funds to tackle a variety of climate adaptation issues here in the Midwest, affecting wildlife, recreation, communities, local economies, extreme events, and restoration approaches. So with that quick overview for today's webinar, let's get to our presentations. Each presentation will be about 7 minutes. Attendees can post their questions in the chat at any time, but we will wait until the end of all presentations to start to address those questions in the chat and also allow for additional time for any additional questions or discussion from the audience. Our first project for today's webinar is titled Restoring for Resilience, an exploration of past restoration efforts in the Great Lakes. This project is led by Wes Bickford, a biologist at the USGS Great Lakes Science Center based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Wes is a visiting scientist with the Midwest CASC. Wes's research focuses on wetland ecology, wetland restoration, invasive species management, and plant microbial interactions. And he has worked with federal, state, and tribal partners in the Great Lakes region to test new management strategies for invasive species, improve restoration strategies of native plants, and develop tools to support decision-making in a changing climate. Wes, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, thanks to everyone for being here today, and thanks to Jess and Kevin for having me here to talk about this ongoing research project. I'm excited to hear your thoughts about it. So as Kevin said, I'm Wes Bickford. I'm a biologist at the USGS Great Lakes Science Center. I'm based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm working on this project as a visiting scientist with the Midwest CASC, which was a role I took on back in October. So this project, we are recognizing the importance of understanding effectiveness in wetland restoration projects. It's important as an assessment of how well we're doing, but I'd argue it's even more important to ensuring future investments are effective and that resilient to climate change. So I'm working very closely with Kevin O'Donnell on this project, and we're addressing three main goals, and those are listed here: to examine detailed project documentation for recent restoration projects, document perspectives of federal, state, and tribal partners on the use of climate-informed approaches to restoration, and to inform future planning for climate-resilient restoration along Great Lakes coastlines. So I'm going to give you a lot more detail on this and how we're accomplishing this. You can switch to the next slide. So we're focusing on GLRI, or Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, funded projects in coastal wetlands over the past 15 years, like since GLRI has been in existence. And if you can follow my flow chart here on the bottom right, you can see that we started with the entire database of about 8,000 awards that GLRI has given out over those past 15 years. We went then and subset those into projects focused on coastal wetlands. We've removed projects that were primarily focused on monitoring or research only, and then combined awards that were focused on the same project so that we could get to about 343 projects of interest. And as you can see from the map in the top left or top right hand corner, these were focused spread out all over the basin. So, and they were diverse in size and scope. Some of the projects, like the one in the top right, were focused on large area of concern projects. So those would include multiple agencies and other partners, and many other actions that were not primarily just wetland restoration. So this project in particular is from the Braddock Bay Wetland and Barrier Beach Restoration, which was in the Rochester area of concern, which was actually just delisted last year. So I was able to go to this site last year and see this really cool restoration project where they restored this barrier beach that now protects a coastal wetland behind it. So this was one of the very large projects that involve multiple agencies, but other projects were maybe much smaller and maybe work with just a single agency. So very diverse in their size and their scope. Diverse in scope in that many of them focus on multiple different things when it comes to wetland restoration. So again, looking at my flow chart here, you can see that we had kind of binned these projects into 5 different types of goals, or 5 different types of bins of what they were focused on primarily. Those being creation, wetland creation, what were called general restoration, and I'll talk about that in a minute, hydrologic reconnection, invasives control, and planning. So I want to focus first on hydrologic reconnection because this is really a hugely important restoration strategy in the Great Lakes. And it's focused on restoring the hydrology of coastal wetlands. So many coastal wetlands, and I'd say like primarily in Lake Ontario or Lake Erie or some other areas in the Great Lakes, are situated kind of behind earthen levees, such that they reside on the coastline, but they're cut off from interactions with the lake. So fish can't really use them, sediments can't be trapped. All the benefits that we associate from wetlands, those that are disconnected from the lakes or from the rivers, don't really have those benefits. So many projects that were funded by JLRI focused on restoring that hydrology by installing water control structures or fish catch systems that make these wetlands more connected to the lakes and nearby rivers. So this was a broad category that we decided was worthy of exploration as its own category. Many other projects were focused solely on invasive species removal, so primarily Phragmites or cattail. And so there were lots of projects focused on just removing those or getting funding to support control of invasive species. Other projects maybe had multiple techniques, so some invasives control, some new natives planting, maybe some actual earth moving, and so those were kind of binned into these general restoration projects that had multiple things going on at once. And then multiple projects also focused on developing plans for future restoration investments, so they got their own category as well. So you can also then see all of the kind of the numbers of the projects. Once we focused on the projects that were over $100,000 in investment per project, we came up with about 200 projects that we're going to be focusing on for our next steps. So we developed these research questions to ask, did these projects set climate-informed goals? And if yes, how? Meaning, were they explicitly saying, we expect that climate change is going to change water levels this much, and so we're going to plan for that? Or was it just more implicit, so such that they say, well, we've seen fluctuations here in the past, we may see this in the future, so we want to be prepared for such things. We also want to get a sense for exposure. So what climate-linked challenges were these projects actually exposed to over the period of their project lifetime? Then, did projects achieve their stated short and long-term objectives? By looking at what was laid out in their scopes of work, what they proposed to do, we can try to do some assessment to how well they achieved those goals. And then finally, did climate-informed actions impact success? So if they did take actions that were informed by climate-informed planning, did that change whether, or did that impact how well they succeeded in meeting their goals? So we're answering these questions by working with project partners who were JLRI recipients to obtain written records for projects such as scopes of work, reporting data, monitoring reports. And from there, we can kind of make baseline assessments based on project goals and data that were collected. However, we recognize that there's much more to be learned that maybe isn't documented. So we're developing a structured interview approach to gather information about these projects, about a subset of those projects within each of these categories. And so we're working on developing the strategy where we can interview federal and a handful of non-federal partners to learn about what went into the planning process, how much climate hazards were actually considered in that planning process, and how successful the projects ultimately were. And importantly, we want to know, we want to compare outcomes against those original goals, but we also just want to get a sense for satisfaction from the recipients. So how well did they think these projects succeeded? How happy are they with the outcomes, even if they did not achieve their stated goals as stated in the scopes of work? So we think this approach is going to allow us to better understand the ways in which climate-informed planning was implemented in past projects, what approaches were most effective, and how to continue to improve our restoration efforts and safeguard investments in the future. So that is an overview of my project here, and I think that, we can pass to the next speaker.
All right. Thank you, Wes. And just a reminder to everyone, as you're kind of absorbing these individual talks from our speakers, feel free to jot down some thoughts or questions in the chat. Our Next project is titled Providing Region-Level Support for National Parks to Complete Climate Change Adaptation Planning, and is led by Mariel Jones. Mariel is an environmental engineer and hydrologist working with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and the National Park Service in this new collaborative effort. Mariel is interested in wetland and forest hydrology, modeling climate change impacts and adaptation, and working with the public to help them gain a better understanding of climate change and how it may affect them. Mariel, floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Kevin, and thank you everyone for coming over to hear us talk about our projects today. As Kevin said, my name is Mariel. I am an ORISE fellow, a postdoctoral fellow here at the CASC. And I just joined recently, and I'm very grateful to be here. So I'll talk a little bit about a pretty new project that we are working on with the National Park Service, which is a collaboration we're very excited to continue to develop. And the overarching kind of goal of this project is really just to provide the National Park Service with some support to understand and to better kind of capture future climate vulnerability assessments to their park infrastructure. So this could be lighthouses, ranger stations, trails, campgrounds, bridges. There's a lot of infrastructure actually that goes into a national park, even though most of the time you're there to see the lovely nature. So kind of park to infrastructure level vulnerability. And one of the things that we're kind of critically interested is being able to integrate the work that we do back into national parks, kind of databases and decision-making tools. So as weather hazards are becoming more prevalent in the national parks, there have been a variety of incidents over the last decade that have disrupted park operations and really the ability of visitors to enjoy the parks. So this photo on the left was from a recent trail collapse, actually, that was due to a washout this spring at Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore in the UP. So if any of you have been there, I think this trail is still closed. It's been a couple of months. As you can see, there was extensive damage to the kind of boardwalk area, and still fixing that. If you can click to the next slide, talk a little bit more in depth. So over the past several years, the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program has put together some great work doing some initial kind of high-level scenario planning for the national parks. So they've produced reports for each of the individual kind of parks across mostly the Midwest region where we're focused, in order to estimate climate exposure in a particular kind of warm, wet, and hot, dry scenarios. And this is focused mostly on temperature and precipitation exposure. And the kind of interesting part where this project comes in is that we want to build on this. So if you're willing to click again twice. In order to be able to speak kind of more directly about infrastructure, we need to build on these high-level vulnerability assessments. So this is where this project comes in, because there are a lot of different types of hydrological and climatological events that can affect infrastructure that have a little bit less kind of wealth of information about how to actually estimate exposure and vulnerability. So for one, we think a lot about severe damage from infrastructure can be caused by snowstorms, thunderstorms, derechos, high wind events. So a lot of convective systems. So for instance, the top photo on the right was from Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. This was a storm surge event that happened in 2017 that was caused by a mixture of thunderstorm and high winds and ended up taking out this boathouse and a marina that are only recently starting to be restored. And so these are events that we don't actually have a great handle on how we can estimate them, 10 to 30 to 70 years in the future, but they clearly do extensive damage to the infrastructure at these parks. So that's kind of the first part that we're hoping to start tackling with this project. Um, the second part is that infrastructure is an interesting beast to assess vulnerability of. So, for one, sometimes the kind of sensitivities to climate change and the adaptive capacities are actually easier to estimate in some ways because infrastructure has, engineering technical limits to it. But we also have to account for complicated things like maintenance cost and cumulative wear and tear. And really just the money that is able to repair these types of systems. So we'll be working directly with land stewards and park managers in order to be able to estimate kind of these types of new data for the water systems, the campsites, all of the facilities at each of the national parks. So the hope with this project, kind of the first part, uh, which we'll expand upon in the future, but like I said, this is a relatively new, is just to be able to expand upon the current assessments that the National Parks Climate Change Response Program has been able to do and provide much more park specific and infrastructure specific data for parks managers to be able to use when they're considering um, do I need to update this trail? We had a washout here. What kind of thing do we need to replace it with? So these kind of questions, we want to be able to supply them with as much information as possible. So yeah, that's my segment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mariel. All right, so let's move to project number 3. It's titled Assessment of Habitat Restoration and Adaptation Successes and Opportunities in the Mississippi Rivers National Park Post-Emerald Ash Borer Infestation. This project is led by Marcella Windmuller-Campioni. Marcella's overarching research goals are to explore the underlying dynamics of forests, how forests develop or are impacted by current and future disturbances, and to use that basic science to develop management which allows the sustainable use of forest ecosystems in the face of changing conditions. And Marcella, please go ahead with your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. And thanks all for joining. I'm Marcella Windmuller-Campioni, and I'm really thrilled to be presenting on behalf of the project. This is very closely partnered with Mississippi Park Connection and the National Park Service, as well as many, many organizations along the Mississippi River. And so if we go to the next slide, we can take a look at the river. And so it's great to be here with the Midwest CASC because we touch so many parts of the Mississippi River. And so the Mississippi River has its start in the headwaters of Minnesota, in northern Minnesota, and then starts extending through the Twin Cities with the lock and dam system. And so within the Twin Cities, and much across many parts of the United States and Canada, have been experiencing the impacts of emerald ash borer. So within the Twin Cities and kind of broader floodplains of the upper Mississippi River, the loss of ash, as well as previously the loss of elm through Dutch elm disease, has really significantly changed our forest. And so some of these pictures on that kind of upper part, we see the creation of canopy gaps, the shift in species composition, including species like garlic mustard or reed canary grass, and really a loss of regeneration. So a shift from having forested environments and forested conditions that do so much to reduce flooding, to provide wildlife habitat, to create shade and shelter. And especially when we think about an urban environment or a city environment like the Twin Cities, these kind of roles that trees play in these ecosystems is huge. And so with that kind of shift in ecosystems, Mississippi Park Connection with the National Park Service started this goal of Plant for the Future, and that link under the kind of clip of the video is about a 3-minute video that goes through more of that kind of history and goals. But from 2018 to 2022, Mississippi Park Connection, in collaboration with many partners, planted 15,000 trees. And these trees were planted in areas that have high habitat conservation values. And so our goal is to kind of mine some of this data of the original information that was used to create these high habitat conservations and see what values come out, how we can use that information for planning, and then to be able to look at the long-term success. These trees have been in the ground for up to 7 or 8 years at this point. There was 15,000 trees and shrubs, 64 different kinds of species, and they were planted in real world conditions. So some of them were planted in gaps that had fencing or tubing, as we can see some of the volunteers at the lower bottom photos taking measurements of those trees. These trees have, a lot of these trees have been GPS. We know where they are, and we can see how we're doing. We can see what species were successful, how they were successful, and under what conditions, to really get at this idea, get at this question that managers have. What trees should I be planting? How should I be taking care of them? And really importantly, along the river environment that are so unpredictable from year to year with lots of changing conditions. How are these changing conditions also influencing that growth and survival? So our big goal is to understand kind of longer term survival and growth, understand species, understand success, and be able to use this information to aid managers as we think about tree planting is one of the best ways we can help maintain healthy forests in our floodplain ecosystems, but making sure the trees that we're planting are trees that will survive and can be around for a very long time. And so that's a really broad overview, and I look forward to having lots of conversations with folks and yeah, answering questions.
All right. Thank you, Marcella. So again, another reminder for folks as you're absorbing all this information to put your questions in the chat. And we're going to get to those here briefly. We've got one more project for today's webinar, and it's titled The Combined Impacts of Climate Change and Intensive Agriculture on Mahnomen. This project is led by Crystal Ng, Associate Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Crystal is not able to join us today. Desi Robertson-Thompson, my colleague and the USGS Midwest CASC Research Coordinator, will be presenting on behalf of Crystal. Desi, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Kevin said, this project addresses the combined impacts of climate change and intensive agricultural practices on water quality in Mahnomen or piscine, which is wild rice lakes in northwestern Minnesota, where agricultural runoff is really exacerbating the problem with water pollution, which endangers both the lakes and wild rice. So wild rice, of course, is a vital plant to Ojibwe and Dakota cultures in the upper Midwest. It is profoundly important to tribal sovereignty. However, it's faced significant decline over the past century, particularly in the face of climate change and land use change. So in partnership with the White Earth Nations Division of Natural Resources, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, tribal harvesters, and researchers from the University of Minnesota, this project examines changes in water quality and quantity to determine the effects of climate and land use change on wild rice. The project will develop water quality monitoring approaches and increase available surveillance data needed by tribal natural resource managers through water chemistry analyses, hydrological monitoring, interviews with knowledge holders, and the development of predictive models to understand the effects of climate on pollutant transport. Ultimately, the results of this project will inform decisions on wild rice protection in agricultural landscapes, including cost-effective monitoring and the identity of wild rice locations that may be particularly vulnerable to future change. And one last thing that I'd like to point out is the interdisciplinary nature of this project. This project emphasizes the importance of real meaningful collaboration between tribal and academic partners, which leads to the integration of Indigenous knowledge and scientific research. And this enriches the understanding, strengthens community ties, and fosters actionable solutions for environmental challenges faced in the watershed. If you want to go to the next slide. And I'm going to leave the slide up for Dr. Crystal Ng, and I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any of your questions. I cannot answer any specific questions about the project, but if you want to put some in the chat, we can either forward them to Crystal or you can reach out to Crystal yourself. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Jess and Kevin for the Q&A part.
Thanks, Desi, and thank you, Kevin, and all of our speakers. I am going to pull our slides down, and if our speakers would come on video as I rearrange some things here. We invite questions from the audience. Either pop them into the chat or you can raise your hand and ask them directly. Either way works. We've got plenty of time, so please don't hold back anything you want to know. If we need to reference a slide, I'm happy to pull it back up again too, if there's something in particular you want to point out. I know there is one question here for Mariel, which does reference a slide. Mariel, if you want me to pull that up, let me know. It's a question about the data in your second slide on the lower left. Where did you get that data for that graph from?
Yeah, so that's a graph actually directly from one of the current reports that the National Park Service does for their Climate Futures program. So I'm going to post the link to that in the chat. So that's an analysis that they did for each park using CMIP5 kind of climate future data. So they have their own method for going through and picking out potential plausible scenarios and doing that analysis. So they have one of those for every single park. So if you're interested to see what your favorite location may look like in the future, I posted that in there and feel free to go take a look.
Okay, a question for any/all of you. Whoever wants to start, feel free to jump in. If you could get one more piece or source of data that would really increase predictive capacity, what would it be? Just one. Thanks, Olivia.
So I can tackle that. So I think one of the pieces that we're learning is particularly important in floodplains is that interaction between soil water and kind of photosynthesis and mechanisms and what ends up being survival and growth. And so if we had a better understanding of how soil water and moisture levels change throughout a growing season, I think that would be huge to understand how that then directly relates to some of these more easily applied measurements like height or diameter or status. And so really trying to tackle when does a tree start to, like, that soil piece and soil moisture piece would be critical for us.
I can tackle this one too. Olivia, am I allowed to say money? Because I think that so money for monitoring, I think, is what would be wonderful in these projects. Dedicated money for monitoring restoration projects over the long term would give us really high quality monitoring data to be able to assess effectiveness over time.
That is an excellent and difficult question. Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned kind of the wind thunderstorm projections that are quite difficult. There's some work that we've been looking at that's had success estimating that, but the snowfall aspect is actually still a big kind of question mark. So I don't know if there exists a great way of estimating kind of snowstorms, snowstorm frequency, snowstorm depth, but that would be phenomenal if that was a thing that was out there.
Thanks all. Anyone else have a question? Again, you can raise your hand if it's a, a longer question or a comment, or you can pop it in the chat. I'm really comfortable with silence, so I'll give you all a few minutes to think about it.
I'm not comfortable with silence. So I'm curious about some of the partnerships that were presented across the projects. And I'd wonder, kind of like Olivia's question, is there a partner that isn't currently engaged in your project that would be valuable to include if there was another phase, if you will, of your project? Someone you'd like to bring to the table, someone you'd like to engage that could, deepen the research or the results. Not necessarily a single organization, but however you want to answer.
Or I'll add a twist to that question too. Any changes you've seen in partners over the last 6 months, for example, that are affecting the relationships?
I mean, I can take that one. That's certainly something that has been changing with the partnership with the National Park Service. As you all know, they've been having severe reductions in their staffing. And so, yeah, as I was kind of thinking initially about Alyssa's question, I was like, well, actually it would just like there are certain layers of the park system that feels like are missing currently from the table, and that's those on the ground folks who we have not yet really gotten to connect with because everyone within the park system right now are very strapped for time, for just people power. So unfortunately, that's something that is kind of missing from the equation right now, and we're working on ways to make do with it. So, yeah.
I can go next. So I think one of the pieces that makes the project I get to work on and lead and coordinate so interesting is when we think about cities and city environments, the range of different organizational levels that work in that space, from federal, state, tribal, individual, community level, to individual people making decisions. Those are all key groups kind of stewarding trees and ecosystems. And I think those groups that are at the community level and individual level are areas that are so important, but are really more difficult to organize and kind of work across really even the small area of the Mississippi River recreation area. It's not that big compared to like a state or anything like that, but that's still probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of community groups, but could have so much impact. And so I think that would be like a next level, would be thinking about how community groups or how those groups really can make huge impactful changes, and kind of getting a better understanding of those needs and directions and management that folks are doing.
I can add for my project, since we're doing such a large scale assessment across the basin, we are and as I mentioned, with these projects, there are multiple layers of different agencies and groups that are involved and partners that are involved. We may be able to speak with the upper levels of that that kind of hierarchy, but less time spoken with the people actually on the ground doing the work. And so more input from the people on the ground doing the work would be really beneficial. But in a project this large, it's difficult to imagine how we get all of that information and put it into something coherent that we can, I guess, standardize across the basin. So yeah, those are the types of groups that I think would be really valuable to this conversation in terms of how to make our restoration efforts more effective in the future. And I think throughout the process, we'll be kind of learning ways that in the future we can incorporate those types of voices and helping that information filter back up to the planners.
Thanks all. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the answers. Anyone else with a question or a comment before we wrap up here?
I'll ask a quick follow-up question to just, because I am interested in the partnership and collaboration aspects, and something that we value very much in all the work of the Midwest CASC. So I'm interested in what strategies or approaches you found most effective when first reaching out to partners or collaborating with partners. And I recognizing, of course, that we're very early in the project, but in this sort of ideation of these projects, and if you have any kind of words of wisdom, words of advice you'd like to share on to others looking to establish successful partnerships.
So in my project's case, this was a project that was kind of led and been discussed by many of the organizations and many of the partners. And it was a big priority, and it was Mississippi Park that started the Plant for the Future. So they led the management, they led the implementation, and now kind of being able to think about that research and monitoring. And so Wes, that money for monitoring really resonates, because right, that is really what I'm grateful for, that we get to monitor, we get to look at this long-term data, and without the Midwest CASC, we wouldn't be able to do that. And so I feel grateful that I get to kind of step into partnerships that have been developed, and a lot of it is listening and kind of being able to see where the direction is needed, what are the skills, how do we kind of leverage support, and then being able to set all these results in context of what is doable, how can these results be interpreted and then used in management, and making sure it's this collaborative experience. And so I guess the biggest takeaway is just kind of listening, and listening lots, and just asking questions asking questions to make sure for clarification.
I was going to say something really similar about listening. I don't claim to be an expert in outreach with partners, but what I have been able to learn, I guess, over the past several years is just to listen to where people talk about there being gaps, and hearing this over and over again, that like we don't actually know how effective these projects have been over the long term. We haven't been able to look at that, or those types of things. They just kept coming up, to where when we put this project together and we started reaching out to partners, people were really enthusiastic about it, because they were like, yes, I'm so glad that somebody's looking at this. So it was just about listening to those issues over time. Hearing the ways that people were concerned about, or hearing what they were concerned about in their restoration projects, and where knowledge gaps were, and then having conversations about how we could best approach that problem. So we worked on bringing partners in that were recipients of GLRI funding, and kind of talking about the basic research questions, and then thinking about having conversations with them about what how might or what are we missing here. Like that was one of the questions we generally asked to people. How might we where might we find gaps? What might we be interested in looking at that we haven't thought of yet? Those types of questions, where we really got people excited about the work, and we're excited to engage again with these folks and see if at what level of excitement still exists, and hopefully push it all forward. So.
Yeah, I can kind of add to that. I am also very grateful that I stepped into this partnership with the National Park Service, although it is a new one, and I am kind of the first instance of work directly with the Park Service, so I feel a bit of responsibility to make sure it goes well because of that. And so I certainly echo the listening, and the other part that I'll kind of add is that there's a bit of like adaptability, really. Like we want to make sure that at the end of the day, what we are providing to the Park Service is as useful as possible. So part of that is listening, but part of that is making sure that we are structuring kind of our project and the outcomes around the way that the Park Service works. And so fundamentally understanding their program structure and the tools that they have and the tools that they find useful, and integrating our work back into that. And so we're not necessarily creating like new tools, new dashboards that won't get touched, but making sure that fundamentally what we are providing will be helpful in the end, really. So.
Okay, well, thank you everybody again for joining us today. Thank you to all of our speakers for presenting their work. Really exciting to see these projects kind of kick off. Kevin, anything you want to add before we fully wrap up here?
Nothing to add, Jess.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I am gonna first just put a note in the chat with a link to our next seminar, which is July 28th. I hope you all can join us there. And then I'm gonna launch a quick poll so you can tell us how we did today and help us make sure we're planning useful and interesting seminars for you all in the future. Otherwise, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Enjoy your Mondays.